Before we go any further, subscribe, like, and leave a comment, because stories like this don't just unfold, they close in on you. And once you hear what was said on this prison phone call, you'll understand why some words are never supposed to be spoken out loud. The sirens cut through the early morning fog as patrol cars boxed in a gray sedan on the outskirts of Des Moines. The driver didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. When officers pulled him out, his hands were steady, his face calm. Inside the trunk, they found the reason the night shift detectives would never forget this case. Evidence linking him to a disappearance that had haunted Iowa for nearly 6 months. The man's name was Marcus Hale, 34 years old. Prior convictions for fraud and burglary. No history of violence. And yet, here he was, being led into county jail as investigators realized something far worse than they'd expected. Marcus had been orchestrating more than theft. He'd been directing people on the outside, quietly, patiently, from behind bars long before this arrest. At the center of the investigation was Emily Carter, a paralegal who vanished after leaving her office late one Friday evening. Her car was found abandoned near the river. No signs of a struggle. No witnesses. Just a phone left behind, wiped clean. For months, detectives chased dead ends until a financial analyst noticed something odd. Emily had recently been working on a SEAL case connected to Marcus Hale's earlier conviction. Detective Aaron Klein was the first to request Marcus's jail phone records. Prison calls are recorded. Everyone knows that. A calm, automated voice warns inmates before every call. This conversation is subject to monitoring and recording. Most inmates talk in fragments, code words, half-jokes meant to hide meaning. Marcus, however, spoke like someone who believed he was smarter than the system. In one call to a woman listed as his cousin, Marcus laughed softly and said, "You know what they tell us not to talk about. Locations, names, timelines." He paused and added, "Good thing I never break rules." The line went silent for 3 seconds. Then the woman replied, "You already said too much." That single exchange caught Klein's attention. Investigators began listening closer, replaying hours of audio. Marcus never mentioned Emily's name. He never described a crime. But he talked about loose ends, about files that shouldn't exist, about how some people think prison walls make you powerless. Then came the call that changed everything. Marcus leaned close to the phone and said, almost casually, "If anyone asks, remind them I can't talk about what happened after the river." The analyst froze the audio. Klein felt his stomach drop, because Emily Carter's body had never been found, and the river had never been mentioned by police, by media, or by anyone outside the investigation. Marcus had just said the one thing inmates are never allowed to say on a recorded prison call. And now, investigators had to ask a terrifying question. If he was careful enough to avoid names and details, what else had he already done without anyone listening? By the time sunrise hit the courthouse windows, the investigation had shifted from a missing person case to something far more dangerous. Marcus Hale's prison calls were no longer background noise. They were a roadmap. Detectives pulled every recorded call he'd made in the last 18 months, stacking transcripts across a conference table until it looked less like paperwork and more like a warning. What unsettled them wasn't what Marcus said. It was how confidently he avoided saying it. He never used real names. He replaced places with jokes, dates with vague references, instructions with casual memories. To anyone else, the calls sounded harmless, banter between an inmate and people on the outside. But to Detective Klein, it felt rehearsed, like a man practicing restraint while still making himself understood. One call stood out. Marcus spoke to a man identified only as R. The automated warning finished, and Marcus exhaled slowly. "Crazy how quiet things get when people stop asking questions," he said. "Almost like they're not around anymore." R laughed nervously. "You're talking too close to the edge." Marcus replied, "Relax. I know what I'm not allowed to say." That sentence alone was enough to escalate the case. Prosecutors filed for emergency subpoenas. Phone numbers linked to Marcus's calls were traced, revealing a loose network of former associates. None violent, none obvious criminals. People who blended in. People who wouldn't draw attention while doing someone else's work. Then the case took a turn no one expected. Emily Carter's apartment was re-examined. In a storage closet investigators had already cleared once, a forensic tech noticed scuff marks behind a false panel. Inside was a flash drive taped to the wall. It contained scanned legal documents, sealed filings from Marcus Hale's previous case, along with something else. Audio files. Emily had been recording her phone calls. One recording stopped everyone in the room cold. Emily's voice, tense but controlled. "You're calling from prison. This line is recorded." A man responded, voice distorted but unmistakably calm. "That's why I'm not saying anything I shouldn't." Detective Klein recognized it instantly. Marcus. Emily had been communicating with him directly, not as a victim, as leverage. The file suggested Emily had discovered evidence tying Marcus to financial crimes committed while incarcerated. Orders passed through coded phone calls. Money moved through people who thought they were untouchable. She had been preparing to expose it, possibly to trade it, possibly to stop it, and then she vanished. As investigators pieced the timeline together, pressure mounted. Surveillance teams were dispatched to locate the people on Marcus's call list. One of them, a woman named Rachel Dunn, the same cousin from the River Comet, had already packed up her apartment and left town. Another man from the list didn't get the chance. 2 nights later, police responded to a house fire just outside Omaha. The blaze was ruled accidental within hours. But inside the rubble, they found a phone, melted but intact enough for a partial data recovery. The last call placed had been to the county jail, to Marcus Hale. When confronted, Marcus smiled for the first time since his arrest. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You know the rules. I can't talk about ongoing situations." Klein stared at him, realizing something chilling. Marcus wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was testing how much he could say, and how much damage he could still cause, without ever crossing the line. The jail interview room felt smaller than usual, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Marcus Hale sat with his hands folded, eyes steady, wearing the quiet confidence of a man who believed the game was already won. Outside, federal agents moved fast. Phones were seized, bank accounts frozen. Every person Marcus had ever spoken to from behind bars was suddenly visible and scared. Rachel Dunn was arrested 2 states away after trying to cross into Canada with a suitcase full of cash and a burner phone. Under pressure, she cracked. She admitted Marcus had coached her on what to say, what not to say, and most importantly, what to never say on recorded lines. Names, exact locations, confessions. Instead, he taught them to speak in shadows, to let silence finish the sentence. But Rachel also revealed something no one expected. Emily Carter had never planned to disappear. According to Rachel, Emily believed she was in control. She thought the recordings gave her leverage, that Marcus would back off once he realized she could expose him. What Emily didn't understand was that prison hadn't weakened Marcus. It had refined him. He didn't need to give orders. He only needed to remind people what not to talk about. The break came from an unlikely place, the automated prison warning itself. A linguistics expert brought in by prosecutors analyzed Marcus's calls and noticed a pattern. Every time a recording announced that the call was being monitored, Marcus slightly altered his tone, pacing his words differently, not to hide information, but to mark moments, timestamps, signals. The phrase "after the river" wasn't a mistake. It was a reference point. Search teams returned to the riverbanks near where Emily's car had been found. This time, they didn't look for a body. They looked for signs of interruption, drag marks, disturbed soil, a place someone might have stopped rather than finished. They found her less than a mile away, buried shallow, wrapped carefully, almost respectfully. Evidence showed Emily had been held for 2 days before she died. During that time, Marcus had made 3 phone calls, all recorded, all within the rules. In court, prosecutors played the calls back to back. No threats, no instructions, just conversations filled with pauses, half sentences, and reminders about what inmates are not allowed to say. The jury listened in silence as experts explained how those calls coordinated movements, decisions, and ultimately a murder without ever naming it. Marcus never testified. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, he showed no reaction, no anger, no relief. As deputies led him away for sentencing, life without parole, he turned once and looked directly at Detective Klein. "You did a good job listening," Marcus said quietly. "Most people don't." 3 months later, during a routine audit, a corrections officer flagged a call Marcus had made the week before sentencing. It hadn't raised alarms at the time. It followed every rule. No names, no places, no crimes. Just one sentence, spoken calmly. Some lessons take time to sink in. The investigation was reopened immediately because that same morning, another woman connected to Marcus's past had failed to show up for work. Her phone was found on her kitchen table, clean, silent, and once again, the prison calls were already waiting. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, because some crimes don't end when the cell door closes.